My name is Andy Pyle, A-N-D-Y-P-Y-L-E.
And Andy, can you tell us what your connection is to Kent State?
I was an outside agitator. I was in SDS at Michigan State. I came to Kent in the spring of 1969, and I ended up staying here and getting a job and living in Kent. And I was surprised when everything broke out at the beginning of May, and ended up participating in the events on May 3rd and May 4th.
Can you describe your memories of the events on May 3rd and May 4th?
I'd like to start back a little bit further.
Sure.
When I was at Michigan State, I knew Jeffrey Miller. I met him maybe half a dozen times. He lived in one of the dorms, and he was hanging around with the SDS people, and our definition of who was a member was very loose, so we considered him to be an SDS member. And he was very interested in what was going on at Kent. He would read articles in New Left Notes about SDS at Kent State, and we'd talk about those. He was thinking about moving here. And then after I came to Kent, I followed a woman to Kent that I was kind of dating. And then I would go back up to Michigan State, and he would ask me what Kent was like and what the SDS chapter was like and what was going on. He was really, really enthusiastic about coming here. And then when I moved to Kent, I kind of lost track of him. I met him a couple of times in the fall of 1969, and then I didn't see him again until the night of May 3rd, and then saw his body on May 4th and didn't even realize who it was for several years until somebody made the connection for me. I had been in SDS at Kent, which was in a state of wild disagreement within itself, and the factions were like tearing at each other, and I had not gone with the Weathermen. I had gone with a group called RIM 2, Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, based on the name of a position paper. And when I went to their conference, I was very, very depressed at all the chaos there and how everybody was bickering and nobody was interested in the student movement anymore, and it was the worst run thing I've ever been to before or since, and I came back very depressed and got recruited into this little Maoist movement out of Cleveland, which was basing itself mostly on hype, and I was kind of a member of that at the beginning of May of 1970, and I had gone on May 1st and May 2nd to some of their events in Cleveland instead of being down here on the streets in Kent. A number of other people I knew from SDS days were out of town those first 2 days too, and we got together and talked about what was it we had missed. So anyway, I was back in town on May 3rd, and I was up on campus the morning of May 3rd and was just kind of circulating around, and the National Guard was there, and the State Highway Patrol patrolling in Jeeps with their National Guard had their rifles and their bayonets, and I was with a couple of Vietnam vets that weren't active in anything, but I was rooming with them in this house on College Street. And we went up to the front campus, to the front of the old administration building, and these guys had been in Vietnam, and so they had brought cameras and they were photographing all the M113 personnel carriers and everything like that. And down by the front steps of the administration building, there was a group of officials. I know Matson was there, some National Guard officials, and Professor Glenn Frank, who I had had numerous run-ins with and who really, really hated what I was doing, as I was agitating for left-wing causes. And Glenn Frank at one point raised his arm and pointed me out to the National Guard officials. And later, a little item showed up in a story in the Cleveland Press about this Maoist group I was in, where that incident was recorded in the list of activities I had been doing, and I was accused of having been photographing military equipment at Kent State. Glenn Frank did a complete change of heart after the shootings and became a really great person. But up until then, he was really not liking what anybody else was doing. He was saying, shut up and go home all the time. Then later that day on May 3rd, there was kind of a crowd gathered around the Victory Bell, and there were stories going on about what we were going to do that night. And there was nobody in charge. It was like, there was apparently some talk going on in the dormitories, and people were like kind of coming to like loose conclusions about what we were going to do, but it was characteristic of the whole weekend that there was no leadership of any organized form. It was just like, we're gonna, people would like do this and all that. The other thing that was going on in that talk session that lasted a couple hours before sundown around the Victory Bell is that people were talking about whether or not the National Guard had loaded rifles or whether they had blanks. And first time I heard the story about the blanks, I thought, oh, well, yeah, maybe it's blanks. And then my buddy and me and some other people talked about it, and it just seemed totally impossible that they would be out there on duty with blanks. So we started telling people, don't believe that they've got blanks. They're the military. They don't do that. And unfortunately, not very many people believed us. It was the big rumor that night and the next morning on May 4th that the National Guardsmen had fixed bayonets on their rifles, but that they were carrying blanks. And to this day, I regret that I wasn't more effective in convincing people that those were loaded guns. So the sun went down on May 4th, and a crowd grew. It was a Sunday night, I believe. The dorms weren't fully full yet. And the National Guard gave us some kind of order, I don't remember exactly what it was, to disperse. And we went up over the hill in the direction of where the shootings eventually took place. And there was a helicopter or two that were diving on us with searchlights, and they would come down low and shine these bright lights into the crowd. Part of the crowd split off and headed over towards the university president's house. And there's a whole story about that I wasn't a part of because I wasn't in that part of the crowd. I'm sure you have a dozen accounts of that from other people. But the part of the crowd I was in split off and went on down to Tri-Towers and went into the pit at Tri-Towers and milled around for a while. There was tear gas during this time. Not heavy. I mean, I've been tear gassed worse. We'd go to Washington, D.C., and we would just get hellaciously tear gassed to the point where you couldn't even stand up sometimes. And this was tear gas, but people were picking it up and trying to throw it back, or at least throw it out of the area. And you could hear the helicopters circling around and around. And me, and I think I was with my buddy, maybe a couple of us, we decided, the rumor was going around that the National Guard was going to come into the dormitories and arrest people. So me never having been a Kent student and having no legitimate reason to be there, and I took off and ran across the street into the apartment buildings, the private apartment buildings behind Tri-Towers, and some people put me up for the night. They were standing out in the parking lot of the apartment building with a radio tuned to the National Guard's frequency, and they were talking about how they were setting up mortars. Now, I don't know if they were setting up mortars so they could shoot flares, which mortars sometimes do, or what, but they were setting up mortars. So I had a very restless sleep there. Took off at sunrise. Went back to my room on College Street, met up with a couple people. So we're now at the morning of May the 4th. Went back up on campus, went to the site of where the ROTC building had been burned, and you could smell the smell of a fire. And one of my roommates in this house where the veterans lived was an ROTC student, and he was one of the people who was assigned to go digging through the rubble of or the embers, or whatever you want to call it, of the building and pull out the rifles that had been stored there for the rifle range in the basement. And the ROTC students had M14s, which were a newer rifle than what the National Guardsmen were carrying. They had old M1s from World War II in Korea. And he was down there like pulling this stuff out. And we had to take a detour around the perimeter that the guard had around the side of the ROTC building. And people would walk up to the guardsmen on the line there and say something. And most of us tried to be like halfway friendly to them. And a few people got a little hostile with them. But it wasn't a big scene. It wasn't like a crowd or anything there. Because if it had been a crowd, it would have been ordered to disperse. And then the crowd started gathering for noon because the rumor had gone around that we were all going to gather at noon on the Commons at the Victory Bell. Ken Hammond got up on top of the Victory Bell platform and gave a call for a strike. And at that point, the order came to disperse from the National Guard. The Jeep drove out. You've all seen pictures of it. There was tear gas. They were throwing tear gas, and people with nice throwing arms were throwing it back. And then the skirmish line of guardsmen started advancing, and we were all moving back up over the hill. And they were like slowly coming up the hill. This was a Monday, so the school was back in session. Everybody was back on campus, and while all this was going on, there were like people walking to class, people coming from class, taking detours and everything because of the National Guard perimeter and because of us and stuff like that. And people were standing on the hillsides, kind of like just watching with textbooks in their hands and everything like that. So we go up over the hill, and I was with two friends who were kind of like semi-related to this Maoist movement, and of course nobody had any big plan about what to do, and nobody was listening to anybody. It was just kind of like flowing. Some of us had kerchiefs to put over our noses because of the tear gas. Most didn't. There wasn't an air of panic, but there was kind of an air of excitement in the crowd. I ended up over by the Prentice parking lot, pressed up against Prentice Hall with a small group of people. Alan Canfora and Chip Canfora were in that group. My buddy was in that group. There were 4 or 5 others. And the National Guard marched down onto the practice field and wheeled and turned. And they were probably about 75 to 100 yards away from us. And there was kind of a standoff developing, during which people were looking around for things to throw at the National Guard, and there was almost nothing to throw. There are references in the records being made to rocks. There were little tiny pebbles like gravel, and not very much of that around in the parking lot where it had like fallen off of cars at the end of winter or something. And at that point, the discussion was still going on about whether the National Guard was carrying blanks or whether they had live ammunition. And the people who were saying that the National Guard had blanks were saying it because they actually believed it to be true. It's not like it was some put-on thing or anything. So most of us couldn't throw far enough to get a rock out to where the National Guard was. There was one guy in the crowd with the little crowd, the bunch, the group, the pod, whatever, that had a pretty good throwing arm, and he was able to reach them, but the rocks were too small to have any impact. And then I don't remember if this happened before or after, but at one point the National Guardsmen pointed their rifles at us. I think they were kneeling, or some of them were kneeling, and the rest were standing. And at this point, Alan Canfora decides to go out on the field by himself. There's a famous picture of this. So he went out there, and then he comes back, and he gives this quizzical little smile of his, and just kind of that head shake that's real characteristic of him, and says, "Blanks." And then he's back in the crowd, and the National Guard, after a while, I think there was some tear gas going back and forth then. John Philo, the photographer, was in that little pot of people, and me and my buddies with the little Malice group asked him not to take our pictures, and that's why there's no pictures of me or my buddy in the photographic record of that day, because he was cooperative. He didn't take our pictures if we didn't want them taken. So there was kind of a little standoff there for a while, and then the National Guards huddled, and I don't know if they're in radio contact with their higher-ups or not, but they were down there. They were really isolated, because by this time they were cut off from the main body of the National Guard at the perimeter by the ROTC building. And the space in between them had filled up with students who were walking to class or who were watching. It was just kind of like a spectacle. There was this group of National Guardsmen at the bottom of the hill, and this little group of protesters over by Prentice Hall, and then there was crowds around. It was a bright, sunny day, a little bit cold. Most people were wearing jackets. And then they decided to make their way up the hill, and we thought it was over. I mean, not the whole day's events would be over, but that the episode was over, and that they were going to return back to their base. And they went up the hill, and the crowd kind of parted and got out of their way as they were coming, because they looked kind of scary. They had fixed bayonets and gas masks and everything. And I had been telling people, if they shoot, hit the dirt immediately. Don't try and run. You cannot outrun a bullet. But they got to the top of the hill, and I wasn't looking at them directly at the time, but I heard the sound. And I'd been a target shooter back in high school. I know what it is. You know, it's the sound of a gun going off. So I hit the dirt immediately, and I think I was probably the only one that did. There's a photograph of a bunch of people running, and I'm the one that had hit the dirt. I was laying on the ground. And so my buddy started to run, and I yelled, "Hit the dirt," and he hit the dirt beside me. Oh, I've left something out. As the National Guard was going, I left two things out. I'm going to correct the record right now. As the National Guard was going back up the hill and we thought it was over, my buddy, with the one with the good throwing arm, managed to find a rock and managed to throw it up there and hit one of them in the back, and you could see the guy kind of flinch. And he said, "I got him." And then that was the only rock he had, and that was, the end of that. But it probably didn't really improve their attitude any with the National Guard up there. The other thing I want to put in is that before this episode started, before the National Guard came out in the Jeep, Professor Frank again was going through the crowd telling people, "You're in great danger here, you better go home now, just get out of here." And he said it to me once, and I started to say something to him, and then he turned around, and he just kept going. He was like a robot going through the crowd, repeating this over and over. He was genuinely concerned, but I mean, we weren't there to preserve ourselves. If we were trying to preserve ourselves, we wouldn't have been there. I mean, we were facing people with fixed bayonets. So anyway, back to the point where the shootings occurred. The gunfire died down, and we couldn't see any guardsmen, and we got up, and there was like wounded people and dead people. And people were helping people get into cars who had wounds, and there were people laying on the ground, and one of them, I think it was my friend Jeffrey Miller, had a huge pool of blood around him. A lot of blood. He'd been hit with an M1 rifle bullet. And it just, people were standing around kind of shocked and dazed, and nobody knew what to do. And when are the ambulances coming, you know? Some guardsmen came down, looked over the scene and left. And what seemed like an eternity later, we started hearing sirens and the ambulances were coming. One guy who was carrying a black flag went over and dipped it in the pool of blood. I remember him like stomping up and down. I mean, it was like a scene. Somebody fainted. So eventually the ambulances came, and they were like, it seemed like the first one got there, and why are they always sending one? And it seemed like it was taking a long time to get enough ambulances. And at this point, we still didn't know what to do. I mean, we were like shocked and dazed, and we hadn't known what to do earlier in the day, and we didn't know what to do now. And eventually we went up to the top of the hill, around the side of the building there, and looked down and kind of moved back down the hill towards the Victory Bell. And then one guy went walking right up to the National Guard perimeter and sat down. This was after the shootings. And then people started filtering back up to the National Guard perimeter. I think they were as confused as we were at that point about what to do. And then they started issuing warnings over the bullhorn about you have to move, you have to disperse, and all that. And actually, we did have to move because we were so close to them that if they had done anything, we wouldn't have had a chance to get away at all. And I mean, a bunch of us had just been shot. So we moved over to the side of the little hill there towards the dormitories away from the Victory Belt and sat down and started talking about what to do. And that went on for what seemed like a long time. And part of the reason is people were making statements like, I don't care what happens, I'm not going to move. I don't care if they shoot me. And other people were saying, we all got to get up and leave. And I was trying to say something. I couldn't get a word edgewise, and if I had, I probably wouldn't have known what to say, except that we had to continue the struggle. And at this point, Glenn Frank got up and made his speech, a highly edited, the applause line that follows his speech that's on the audio that everybody has heard is highly edited. Whoever edited it obviously cranked up the volume twice on it, and it sounds like something's even spliced in. There was a presentation at one of the May 4th gatherings by the people who had done the audio, and I believe they stated during that presentation that they had fiddled with the applause at the end. It sounds much bigger than the size of the crowd that was actually there. And during this period of time, we were trying to decide what to do. The crowd was getting bigger, and then it got smaller, and people started leaving. And word came, a few people came down over the hill and said, they're closing the school, everybody's leaving, they're emptying out the dorms. At that point, it became clear that it was really foolish to stay there any longer. And that was the reason that everybody got up and left, and not Glenn Frank's speech. Because after Glenn Frank's speech, a few people left, but most people did not leave, because people were just like, I don't care if they shoot us or not, I'm not going to leave. But after we heard that the school was closing, it was like, well, if everybody's leaving, we better leave too, because we're sitting ducks out here. So we walked around a circuitous route and got off campus and got back to a car and left Kent. And that's the end of my story.
Who do you hold responsible for what happened that day?
I don't want to personalize it too much. Some people look for James A. Rhodes or Richard Nixon or the individual guardsmen or whatever. But we were going up against the system. I mean, what they did there was like peanuts compared to what they were doing in Vietnam every day. And people thought that they had, because they were American college students, that they had some kind of special privilege, and then they found out they didn't. But it was the entire ruling class that was responsible. The individuals that made the decision, like Rhodes and Nixon and the guardsmen and whoever and whatever, they have some additional responsibility, but by and large, the decisions that were made, the decision to go into Cambodia, the idea that America was invincible and it could do anything that it wanted, those were much bigger forces than any one individual.
And why do you think it's important to remember what happened to Kent?
That's self-evident. It's part of our history. It's particularly important for people at Kent because it happened here, but you have to remember this invasion of Cambodia and the shootings at Kent State touched off the biggest student strike in U.S. history. Dozens of ROTC buildings were burned or otherwise demolished or damaged all across the United States. Streets were blocked, schools were shut down, administrations were preemptively shutting down colleges just out of fear of what would happen. It was a huge event. And it didn't stop the war. What stopped the war was when the Vietnamese won the war. But it had a role in that. And I've talked to people I know that were in Cambodia and in Vietnam when this happened, and it made a big impact among the GIs over there too. And the American Army at this point wasn't in very good shape. There was a lot of dope being used, and there was a lot of discontent, and there were officers being fragged, and all this and all that. So it was becoming impossible for them to carry on their war the way they wanted to. Plus, they were losing it. So, yeah, I think it'll be remembered. And in fact, it's being remembered more every year as the backlash after the shootings recedes. If they had to build a gym today, they wouldn't build it where they built it. It's becoming historical in the same way that Gettysburg is historical. We have to look at it as a historical event and not just the fact that there were casualties. Because if you look at the number of casualties as a historical event, compared to what was going on in Vietnam every day, the number of casualties was small. I mean, it's hard to say that when one of your friends is one of the casualties. Oh, there was a small number of casualties, but when you look at the big picture, it was a small number of casualties. Every one of these people was a precious person, but every one of the people that died in Vietnam resisting the American invasion was also a precious life, and we can never forget that. The other thing that never gets mentioned is the strike was called at noon, and within an hour, the entire campus was shut down. Now, strategically, despite the casualties, that's a major victory. It's incredible that you could shut down a college campus within an hour after you call it a strike. So you have to look at it historically and not just, like they do at Gettysburg, where the Sons of the Confederate Veterans have a monument and this and this and that and that. But when you go to Gettysburg, you get a picture of the history and the background and the events, and you don't just think about my brother-in-law got killed. So.
Maybe the last question is just what effect it's had on you personally in the years that followed.
Oh, it's had a big effect. I think it's had a big effect on everybody that was there. First of all, I'm really glad I didn't get shot. I mean, nobody wants to get shot. It's Ohio, so there's some things you do in Ohio, like looking for a job or stuff like that, where you just don't tell everybody that you were there. Because even after all these years, there's a stigma to it. My foreman at work, who didn't know I had been there, used to talk about Kent State, and he'd picked up all these crazy lies off of radio talk shows about how the National Guard was being overrun by a crazed mob and all this and all that. And I actually at one point had to take in the FBI report and show him just how far away the closest person was at the instant of the shootings, and how far it was to the 4 people that were shot and everything, because if I hadn't brought in the FBI report, he wouldn't believe me. When I would travel out of the United States a couple times in the intervening years, people were real interested. They had heard of Kent State, and they knew about it, and when they heard I had been there, they wanted to hear the story. It was not just something that, sent out small ripples from Ohio and then died. So the 2 big questions people always ask you if you were around in the 60s, was, were you in the Army and were you in the anti-war movement? And so I was at one of them, just purely by blind chance. Kent State could have happened. It was going to happen. I mean, it could have happened in Iowa, or it could have happened in, Kentucky, but it happened here. And if it hadn't happened here, it would have happened there, because things were building up in that direction.
Well, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your story with us.
Thanks for giving me a chance to tell it. I've been waiting a long time.